to this morning's online Bible study. Whether you're tuning in at Twitter or Periscope at Bible Study Cam, whether you're on Facebook.com/reflective Bible study, whether you're on YouTube at the Online Preacher, or even at the onlinepreacher.com/live, wherever you happen to be tuning in, whether it's one of those places or somewhere else, whether this is on live or on replay, I want to welcome you to this morning's online Bible study. And this morning, we're going to be focusing in on Luke chapter 22, verses 39 through 46, and talking about one little sliver or snippet of time that Jesus spent in the garden with his disciples on the night of his arrest. And in this passage, as I was looking and studying and figuring out what I wanted to talk with us this morning about, a question or an idea jumped off the page at me, and it's one that we might not often think about. So with that said, let's dive into the passage and discover what we can learn together as we look at this passage. So this is Luke chapter 22. I'm going to start in verse 39, and I'm going to read from the New American Standard Bible. And he came out and proceeded, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples also followed him. When he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him. And being in agony, he was praying very fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground. When he rose from prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow, and said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation." Now, in this first little part of Jesus' time in the garden, there's a number of things that people typically focus in on that would be easy for me to focus in on. There's a lot of focus has been put on emphasizing Jesus' prayer. "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Now that in and of itself is an amazing, powerful prayer. But that's not the idea that I want to focus us in on. Another idea that could easily be focused in on is that an angel came and strengthened him. And while impressive and amazing and significant that also is not what I want to focus us on this morning. The idea of Jesus' sweat being like drops of blood, or perhaps even sweating blood, since that actually is a condition, I probably would slaughter the name of it if I remembered what it was. But that detail, while fascinating, is also not what I want to focus us in on this morning. Instead, when Jesus arrived at the garden, and immediately following waking the disciples up, he challenges them to pray that you may not enter into temptation. Verse 40, when he arrived at the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not enter into temptation." And at the end of verse 46, he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation." And the question that entered my mind as I was reading this is, what temptation was Jesus trying to avoid the disciples falling into or getting sucked into? It's something interesting to think about, because when we look at the events of that night, what should have happened, perhaps we could say, that didn't happen? What temptation could the disciples have fallen into that they ultimately maybe didn't fall into? In my own mind, I can think of a couple things. A few things come to mind. The temptation, or maybe the most obvious temptation you could say, is that when Judas Iscariot and the mob arrive, the easy temptation, the easy thing to resort to or to default to would be fighting to prevent Jesus' arrest. We even see Peter jumping in and slashing his sword at one of the servants of the high priest and actually getting his ear sliced off. And Luke describes how Jesus says, hey, put away your sword. And then Jesus heals the only person who was injured in his arrest. That's easily could be the temptation that Jesus wants his disciples to avoid. But also, if that's not the case, we have an idea that Jesus would want his disciples to avoid the temptation of losing faith because of his arrest. Because of the events of the next 24 hours and 48 hours, you may even say, it would be very easy for the disciples to lose faith in amongst all the confusion and all of the chaos and just their picture of what the Messiah would be being dashed. The disciples had this picture, like society had the picture, that the Messiah would live forever, that the Messiah would never experience death. And repeatedly throughout Jesus' ministry, he kept trying to warn the disciples, hey, I am going to face death, but don't be saddened at my death, you could say, because I will be resurrected. But the disciples missed that. And so Jesus, I think one part of this challenge to not fall into temptation, to pray that God would help you not fall into temptation, would be praying that you would still have faith, that your faith would not completely run out when Jesus is arrested, condemned, and ultimately crucified. An interesting angle for this challenge to pray that you don't fall into temptation would simply be a prayer that you wouldn't take revenge on Judas Iscariot for betraying Jesus. Now we know that when we look at the events of that weekend, Judas commits suicide prior to the disciples being able to take any type of revenge on Judas Iscariot, but that would be an easy temptation we could see entering the disciples' minds. Judas Iscariot being the one responsible for Jesus being arrested and then being taken to the religious leaders to then be tried and condemned and ultimately crucified. Judas Iscariot was kind of the key piece of that weekend that then allowed and led to Jesus being crucified. And so it wouldn't be a stretch in my own mind if the disciples had some revengeful or vindictive thoughts towards Judas Iscariot. But when we look at this passage, there's one more angle that I see. Let me read from verse 45 and verse 45 and 46. When he rose from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. The disciples were probably exhausted and maybe even a little sad. I'm not sure exactly what the sorrow that they would be experiencing would be, but Jesus, if we look at John's gospel, he had just finished sharing this amazing truth, an amazing promise about the Holy Spirit with them, but he also promised them and told them that in order for the Holy Spirit to come, that he would need to leave. And I suspect that maybe some of the sorrow that the disciples were facing was that they were wrestling with the idea of Jesus actually leaving them. He came to the disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow and said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation." The last angle that I want to draw our attention to is the idea of sleeping. Now, we all need physical sleep. Hopefully, depending upon where in the world you are listening to this and what time you're listening to this, you might have even gotten up and just finished sleeping. At least that's the case for me, because I get up and one of the first things I do is prep for and share these messages before I run off to work. But spiritually sleeping is a different scenario. We could be spiritually sleeping, just kind of going through the motions of going to church, maybe reading our Bibles, reading the part of our Bibles according to the daily plan that we have, perhaps even opening up a devotional and reading them. We could just be going through the motions and just not really connecting with God. Or letting that connection that we once had that was a strong connection with God falter. And that could be falling asleep spiritually, and that is a significant temptation that we all face, that we all are able to face regardless of the point in time in history that we live. And the antidote, you could say, to drifting through your spirituality is being woken up. Perhaps a bad circumstance in your life has woken you up, but the antidote to drifting through your spiritual lives is perhaps taking a step back figuratively and a step into recommitting and refocusing on prayer and moving your prayer life into something that brings God into your lives. Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The prayer that we all are challenged with is to help us recognize temptation and then avoid it. And that is powerful to think about, because the closer we are to God, the more we will be able to clearly recognize temptation. And the closer we are to God, the easier it will be for us to lean on Him to help us avoid falling into or getting sucked into the temptation that Satan brings our way. And so that's what I wanted to share with you this morning as we together focus a little bit of time on Bible study, on a passage out of the Bible, but more importantly, as we together focus a little bit of time on Jesus. While we're separated physically through physical distance as well as social distancing and all of the craziness in the world today, let's stay connected digitally, keeping our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our perspectives focused on Jesus. And if you want to share something with me in this passage that I missed or that you believe that I missed and you want to draw my attention to it, jump into any one of the comment boxes. Whether you're watching this on Twitter, Periscope, Facebook, YouTube, any one of the comment boxes, I'll be able to read those responses, and if possible, periodically throughout the day, I'll be able to respond. Now, I won't be able to respond on Periscope because that comment stream ends as soon as this live stream ends, but any one of the other places, jump into the comments and I will keep this conversation going as I'm able to throughout the day as I'm working and doing other things. But regardless of what happens in this life and in this world, let's together keep our hearts and our minds and our eyes and our perspectives focused on Jesus as we take steps moving towards eternity and the end of sin. So thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you tomorrow.